World War II, the war that changed the face of warfare for years to come. But since the war is more remembered for grand strategies and impressive new technology, the simple M4 Sherman can fall by the wayside. It should not. The M4 Sherman was the American tank of World War II, and truly a great tank for the time. And although it might not have flashy features, it did not need them, because the M4 Sherman was not only a very safe and reliable tank, but also a tank with parts that could be changed or upgraded easily due to its widespread standardization. It was a tank designed to be shipped across the ocean and not break down when it gets there, and if it did, it could be fixed in the field. This could not be said about German or Soviet tanks. Now, how did a tank like this get made? The development of the M4 Sherman started in 1941. This is because the Battle of France of 1940 proved to the Americans that their current tank arsenal would not be able to withstand a German assault. The only tanks in their inventory at that time were the M2 light tanks and the M2 medium tanks, both being inadequate against German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. The US Army in response ordered a new tank to be armed with a 75mm gun. While a 75mm gun was available for use, a turret able to mount the gun was not. So while the turret and tank design underwent development, the 75mm would be mounted on the stopgap design, the M3 Lee, in a sponsored mount. This compromise put the 75mm on a lower and limited traverse mount that restricted its fire angle, but did give the Allies a tank with the gun, so it was issued by the thousands until a better design could be made, which was the M4 Sherman. Using many things learned from the M3 production and fielding made the M4 Sherman more reliable, easier to produce, and a safer tank. With Sherman production starting in early to mid 1942 by 10 different manufacturers, the main variants of the tank, the M4, the M4A1, the M4A2, the M4A3, and the M4A4, were rolling out in large numbers by the end of the year. The differences between these types came not from improvements, but rather different manufacturing styles at the different factories, like the casted versus welded hulls and the one of 4 different engines, the R975 radial, the GM6046 twin diesel, the A57 multibank, and the Ford GAA V8. And even with these differences between models, the vast majority of parts remained interchangeable, even to the point where there are stories of tanks swapping turrets. The Sherman tank first saw combat in the North African campaign in the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 in the hands of the British. Nevertheless, the winter of 1942-43, when observers in North Africa reported that American tanks had run well in sand but had bogged down in the mud of Tunisia because the tracks were too narrow, ordnance engineers promptly made the development of wider tracks a high priority project. Immediate replacement by wider tracks was impossible, not primarily because of any difficulty in designing a wider track, but because the problems with the wider track would not fit the existing vertical volute spring suspension. So a new system was designed, horizontal volute spring suspension. But because of the problems involved with redesigning the whole suspension system and making the production changeover, tanks with wide tracks did not become available until late 1944. Military engineers also realized to increase the velocity of their tank weapons, so they started a project of a 76mm cannon that could easily be mounted into existing Shermans. The whole development process was incredibly short. The process initiated on August 1942, and the completed gun, designated the 76 M1, was standardized on September 10th, less than a month later. While the 76mm M1 was completed in 1942, the gun could not be mounted comfortably on the current turret of the M4, so a new turret design was tested during the T-22, T-23 programs. But even when the 76 was fully functional, many commanders on the ground did not actually want the tank. The 75 served them this far into the war, so they felt that there was no need to retrain even their men with the 76mm. This opinion started to change when the big cats of Germany started to appear, and this all came to a head in December of 1944 when the Battle of the Bulge urged many military commanders, even Eisenhower, to request further deliveries of Sherman to only be armed with 76mm cannons. The new units deploying in Europe afterwards had exclusively 76mm Shermans. As standardization in the suspension went on, the HVSS became more and more common in European theater. The M4 Sherman is seen as struggling against heavy tanks of Germany towards the end of the war. So why were they not replaced? Well, there was an attempt to do just that, the M26 Pershing. With a 90mm gun, 100mm of armor, HVVS, and many other modern features made it set to replace the M4. So what happened? The Sherman was working so well that the war ended, and not more than a handful of M26s even saw combat. This is also because Army doctrine preferred to have 2 medium tanks over 1 heavy tank, as well as the fact that a whole new supply lines would need to be made for the M26 to work effectively. Bringing to a point where the Sherman worked so well, it was very often well supported and supplied, which made it very effective.